context of the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in Kosovo, of the successful not only switch on of EU legs, but also the operationality of EU legs in April this year, Kosovo has come back into the picture after having been out of the news for some months before. Let me state at the outset that I'm an ex-SRSG, so I'm not speaking for the United Nations. Likewise, and in spite of my current position as the German ambassador in Stockholm, I do not claim to speak for the German Foreign Ministry on the Kosovo issue. In other words, I speak on my own personal behalf. Kosovo declared independence on 17 February 2008 and was quickly recognized, as you know, by the majority of the EU member states, the US and others. On 15th June 2008, Kosovo's new constitution entered into force, which does not foresee a role for UNMIK anymore. So in a way, I was not the last SRSG in Kosovo, but as also the title says, I was something like the last traditional SRSG with broad authority. So I left Kosovo in June 2008 at this very natural break in time, making room for a new and considerably smaller UNMIK. I did not use the term mission accomplished then, though some did. Since this is also an academic presentation, I thought it would be worthwhile to dwell with diligence on what exactly happened during my tenure from September 2006 until June 2008, in political but also in legal terms, international law terms, with a special emphasis, of course, on the decisive year 2008. And from that we will hopefully be able to extrapolate and maybe even draw some conclusions, not only with regard to the stability in Kosovo and the region, but hopefully also with the art rather than science of peacekeeping. According to Resolution 1244, which was the basis for my mandate, the SRSG controls the implementation of the international civil presence in Kosovo. Key responsibilities are three, namely to administer Kosovo, including maintaining law and order, and at the same time to establish provisional institutions for self-government, the famous PISG acronym, and transferring administrative responsibilities to them. That is the governance role. The second role is to support peacekeeping and peace-building activities with all communities. That is the peacekeeping role. And thirdly, to facilitate the political status process. That is the status process role, to facilitate the political status process. This threefold mandate is quite unique. When it comes to UN peacekeeping missions, let me therefore make a few comments on the governance role of UNMIK and also a few comments on the peacekeeping role before I then will turn to the status process role, and that will be the main subject. On the governance, I should like to highlight that facilitation of the status was of course a priority for the mission, but I tried to make sure that the so-called standards for Kosovo implementation process, with its goals and benchmarks for good governance, and in particular for a multi-ethnic society, also remained active and dynamic. This was largely achieved as documented in the quarterly reports to the Security Council. Although I must say that the political class and line ministries alike were at times distracted due to the status process from the standards process. For practical purposes, the standards implementation process was merged with the so-called European Partnership Action Plan in 2007, thus avoiding a duplication of highly focused working groups while enhancing the majority community's incentives to put real effort into standards implementation. I became increasingly convinced that with regard to standards implementation, UNMIK had largely achieved what was achievable under the circumstances, while further significant progress depended on a successful conclusion of the status process. This was especially true, I think, with regard to the main shortcoming, that is the return of Kosovo's certain IDPs, where the bottom line seemed to be that especially Belgrade was not really interested in a premature quote-unquote success story, in spite of all the efforts we put into this, and in spite of some modest good results. On a different note, I argued with local and international stakeholders in summer 2007 that also the question of having local and central elections in Kosovo in November 2007 had to be placed in the standards context. On the one hand, the moment was not really ideal and convenient with view to the status process to have elections. On the other hand, the elections were required by law and there was a widely perceived lack of legitimacy at all levels of government, also due to the fact that local elections had already been postponed for a year. Postponing elections once again, and then until when, would have sent, in my view, the wrong signal that democracy can be suspended, and in the end, the elections were held, deemed free and fair by the international observers, and succeeded in refreshing the legitimacy of Kosovo's institutions. At that time, I used to refer to the metaphor of a vehicle that has run out of gasoline, called legitimacy, and has to go to the gas station if it wants to roll over the final kilometers, continue the final kilometers to the finish line. Looking back over the past 9 years and with my own personal experience in Kosovo, there can be no doubt that a double structure with an international administration on the one hand and local institutions taking over more and more competencies on the other hand is by design not conducive to optimal governance, especially when its duration is unknown, which translates into no planning horizon. A very important element, I think, when you look at UNMIK. A particular point in question, regardless of its by 1244 design, so to speak, is the accumulation of legislative, executive, and judicial powers with the UNMIK SRSG. The sort of institutional lack of a balance of powers, which was often attacked in the media, including from the human rights perspective. With regard to the latter, we have established the Human Rights Advisory Panel, which is designed to deal with grievances against UNMIK, and in this way provides an appeals mechanism. In potential future interim administrations, it might be an idea to explicitly task different international organizations with different balance of power roles, even if there is a UN umbrella structure, which is advisable in view of the BNH experiences. Let me say a few words about peacekeeping and building and reaching out to the communities. When it comes to UNMIK's role in trying to avoid inter-ethnic conflict and building the foundations for a multi-ethnic society in Kosovo, we had some success during my tenure. I think, like my predecessors, I tried to reach out in particular to the Kosovo Serbs, trying to listen to their concerns, trying to reassure them, trying to familiarize them with the status process, explaining the standards for Kosovo process, and addressing, with constant operational involvement, shortcomings, especially in the area of returns of IDPs. The latter contributed to, I have mentioned it already, a moderate increase in IDP returns. It is important to realize that the Kosovo Serbs are by no means a homogeneous community. On the contrary, the political spectrum ranges from moderates working in and with the Kosovo institutions all the way to some real hardliners. And in this context, since we're looking at my period, it should not be overlooked that Kosovo Serb representatives have, after many years of absence, once again joined the Assembly and the government of Kosovo after the 17th November 2007 elections. A great number of Kosovo Serbs is financially dependent on Belgrade. That is, they are on Belgrade payrolls, especially in the education and in the health sectors, or receive benefits. And of course, one thing the Ahtisaari plan does is that, and I will come to that of course, is that it tries to legalize the financial flows in the so-called parallel sectors. When it comes to these famous parallel structures, I found it necessary and helpful to differentiate. Our policy was to tolerate parallel structures in the education and health sectors, to reject parallel structures in the administration, that is, Belgrade attempts to govern Kosovo more or less directly, and to strongly reject parallel security structures, because the latter two violated not only Resolution 1244, administration and security parallel structures, but also subsequent Belgrade-UNMIK agreements which framed Belgrade's limited acceptable interaction with the Kosovo community. On a different note, and in a way almost regardless of the 17th February 2008 events, inter-ethnic relations in Kosovo are not as bad as they are sometimes portrayed outside of Kosovo, and I think we can certainly extrapolate this to this very day. This is first and foremost true for the relations between the majority Kosovo Albanians and the non-Serbian minorities. But even Kosovo Albanian and Kosovo Serb relations are reasonable in various parts of Kosovo, especially in the so-called mixed municipalities, and when it comes to doing business together. Even in Mitrovica, I was invited to regular north-south business luncheons, believe it or not. Nevertheless, inter-ethnic relations in Kosovo need continued international community support and focus on political infrastructure, economic development, and civil society projects. A systematic, long-term approach to post-conflict peace building and reconciliation, like the OSCE's work with the High Commissioners on Minorities, is needed and deserves every support. It should also be noted that peacekeeping and peace building in Kosovo is not only about the Kosovo Serbs and other minorities, but it is also about the Kosovo Albanian 90% majority and its different segments. They had been deeply traumatized by the 1990s and became increasingly tired and frustrated with their in limbo status since UNMIK's arrival in 1999. Against this background, it was a major challenge to constantly call for patience and point to perspectives without going to the very substance of status, which was not UNMIK's mandate. We could not say the I word. In this context, it should be noted, at least not until a certain date, which you can also ask me in the Q&A. In this context, it should be noted that there were no inter-ethnic violence incidents after 17th February 2008, no inter-ethnic violence incidents after 17th February 2008. And if the January 09 incidents in Mitrovica and some recent incidents about the housing in the north qualify under this heading is very questionable. Those were violent incidents, but they were not necessarily inter-ethnic. Let me now come to the status process, which I think is at the core of your interest. When I started my mandate as the SRSG on the 1st of September 2006, the process to determine Kosovo's final political status under the auspices of the UN Special Envoy and meanwhile Nobel Peace Laureate Martti Ahtisaari was in full swing. And I understand that Martti Ahtisaari has been here since they received the part. It was widely expected at that time that before the end of that year, which was 2006, the Special Envoy would submit his proposal to the Secretary General and by extension to the Security Council, where a resolution would then endorse it, paving the way for UNMIK transitioning to a new EU-led international civil presence. That was the plan. Prudent planning for this post-status future required the immediate creation of a mission-wide project called Transition Planning and Implementation, we call it TPI, with an UNMIK internal, an international, and a local dimension, including all relevant steering groups and working groups. In a short time, this TPI produced a very detailed blueprint, a Gantt chart, on how exactly UNMIK would phase out and the new international civil presence would phase in during the 120-day period foreseen in the Ahtisaari plan. This blueprint is a living document. Since its inception, it has been adapted to changing circumstances, like the non-endorsement of the Ahtisaari plan by the Security Council, but in this mutatis mutandis way, it is still the basic document that has governed the downsizing of the mission until the final point today. Obviously, TPI was mainly about the technical side of the status process. The political side was, of course, an even bigger challenge when it became clear that the Special Envoy would not present his proposal until after the Serbian parliamentary elections in January 2007. At that time, expectation management, and in particular calling for patience, was key, at least inside Kosovo. With regard to the international community, the contact group and the UN, however, my key message was a different one. It was please keep the momentum in the status process, and I was comparing it to the bicycle rider who needs to keep pedaling, otherwise he or she will fall. Expectation management was necessary not only with regard to a widely perceived loss of momentum, at the end of 2006. It was also necessary with regard to the emerging structure and contents of this Special Envoy's proposal, with its two parts, which the comprehensive proposal on decentralization, which is local self-governance, cultural heritage, political decision-making, etc., with its minority protection provisions, which became public at the end of February 2000, or in the beginning of February 2007, and the report of the Special Envoy with the actual status proposal for independence, which became public at the end of March 2007. We as UNMIK engaged very actively in explaining the potential advantages of the comprehensive proposal by continuously reaching out to all communities in Kosovo. In the majority Kosovo Albanian community, due to communication from the negotiators in the so-called Team of Unity, President, President of the Assembly, Prime Minister, and two opposition leaders, but more so due to a very active media scene, its content became increasingly clear even before the Special Envoy presented it. It was met in this winter of 2007 with great skepticism or even hostility because of quote-unquote all the concessions to Belgrade. Anxieties peaked, especially on and after 10 February 2007, when violent anti-UN and anti-PSG demonstrations in Pristina led to the death of two demonstrators who were victims of UNMIK police rubber bullet use, and I must add unprofessional rubber bullet use. The actual stepping down of the UN police commissioner at the time did much to avoid a spiral of violence. In the Kosovo Serb community, and different from other communities like the Albanian community or the other minority communities who were represented in the institutions, there was a general lack of knowledge about the comprehensive proposal. When we did our town hall meetings, we heard a lot the phrase, "We do not hear from Belgrade's negotiators," and there was a lack of knowledge about its unprecedented minority protection elements. As a rule, when we presented it, the Kosovo Serbs reacted positively to these elements once they learned about them. The UN Secretary General fully endorsed Ahtisaari's status proposal when it was presented in the Security Council at the beginning of April 2007. He called it a fair and balanced proposal. After the presentation, the Security Council decided to visit Kosovo to gather more information and did so swiftly at the end of April 2007. Subsequently, with ever-increasing local anxieties, the Security Council tried to agree on a resolution for Kosovo. However, in July 2007, as you all know, it became clear that this was not possible. At that time, it became most evident how tired, how frustrated, and how disappointed the vast majority of the people in Kosovo were with the status process, which in their view had started no later than 1999. They were frustrated with the process, they were frustrated with the leaders, they were frustrated with the international community, including the UN. Those who in Kosovo had always argued that there would never be a solution were vindicated. Calls for a unilateral declaration of independence were louder than ever before and gained traction not only in the media but also in the political class. This in turn raised anxieties in Kosovo's Serb community in this summer of 2007. While I continued to reach out to all communities in Kosovo trying to address anxieties, calling for restraint, calling for patience, and strongly discouraging unilateral steps, I also appealed to the international community to avoid the perception of a void, which was quickly spreading, and to restore the momentum in the status process. The people need clarity on status was my key message at that time, and also in the Security Council. Subsequently, the so-called Troika process was initiated in August with envoys from the EU, the US, and Russia trying to convince the two parties one more time that direct bilateral agreement was the most advantageous solution. The process terminated in December 2007 without an agreement between the parties. I did not belong to those who thought that this process had lacked any prospect for finding such an agreement, in particular when it came to something like an agreement to disagree type, as was the case, for example, with West Germany and East Germany, which on the basis of the principle West German non-recognition of East Germany, nevertheless both joined the United Nations and had a structured relationship. In this spirit of realistic optimism, I did what I could to encourage the parties, especially the team of unity, to be in good faith, to stay in good faith, and be constructive in the Troika talks. However, there were limits to what I could do and an apparent lack of incentive on both sides, which was widely attributed in the case of Belgrade to the perceived silver bullet, quote unquote, of the owning the Russian veto right in the Security Council, and in the case of Pristina, to the US, quote unquote, enough is enough promise to bring these things to a close one way or another. In any case, the most tangible result of the Troika process was the parties' continued commitment to non-violence and more generally to a civilized process. Maybe I should add, come what may. When the Troika efforts failed, the 6-member contact group, the key link between the Security Council and us on the ground, became visibly divided. Russia, like Belgrade, called for more negotiations, and the so-called Quint, France, Germany, Italy, the UK, and the US, started to prepare with Pristina for what was called at the time a coordinated declaration of independence on the basis of the Ahtisaari plan. NATO and the EU declared their willingness in December 2007 to continue to help Kosovo. The EU stressed its intention to support new international civilian presence, ICO, to be headed by Peter Veit, and to deploy a rule of law mission named EU-LEX to be headed by Yves de Cameron. It was indicated that the coordinated declaration of independence was supposed to happen sometime after yet another round of Serbian parliamentary elections in January 2008. And then on 17 February 2008, to nobody's surprise, the Assembly of Kosovo did indeed declare independence on the basis of the Ahtisaari plan, which was quickly recognized by the majority of EU member states, the US and others. These events put UNMIK and myself into a difficult position, especially since in legal terms, both groups of UN member states, that is Russia, Serbia, etc. on the one hand, and the EU, EUS, etc. on the other hand, based their approaches on Resolution 1244, albeit different interpretations thereof. The former group argued that the Declaration of Independence, lacking agreement from Belgrade, was null and void, hence Kosovo would remain a part of Serbia. The latter group argued that 1244 was silent on how the final settlement that it refers to was generated. Hence, by declaring independence on the basis of the UN Special Envoy plan, that was also welcomed by the Secretary General, by being recognized on that basis, Kosovo had entered into the final phase as per Article 11F of Resolution 1244, while interim phase provisions of 1244, including those related to former Federal Republic of Yugoslavia sovereignty and territorial integrity, were abrogated. In any case, I duly reported to the Secretary General on all developments and asked for instructions how to implement my mandate under changing circumstances. The Secretary General did not instruct me to invalidate the Declaration of Independence. He did instruct, however, that UNMIK implement its mandate in a status neutral way, which meant, on the one hand, a degree of firmness, because there still was a mandate to implement, and on the other hand, a degree of caution, and especially constant dialogue with all local actors, and to the degree possible, also with Belgrade. In this context, it is important to understand that both groups of UN member states concur that for the time being, UNMIK's and KFOR's competencies under Resolution 1244 and the constitutional framework that was built on it were still valid. Unfortunately, this view was not entirely shared by all local actors, who, however, expressed their rejection in divergent ways, with critical implications for the mission's responses to them. With regard to Pristina's authorities, while dialogue was quite regular, firmness was called for in making it clear to all that not only Resolution 1244, but also the constitutional framework was still in place, that the SRSG continued to sign or reject laws in that winter of 2008, after February 17th, that UNMIK was still administrating Kosovo, that especially in the rule of law sector, UNMIK continued to have ultimate control, etc. This led to tensions which were, however, diffused without incident, since in principle the Pristina authorities were respecting my primacy and that of Resolution 1244 and the constitutional framework in this what they deemed to be the quasi-transition period called for under the Ahtisaari plan. And they recognized that, and the recognizers did the same thing. Right, and the transition period under the Ahtisaari plan was supposed to conclude only with the entry into force of the Kosovo constitution. So there was, in principle, no question that UNMIK's authority was still there. With regard to the Kosovo Serbs and the government in Belgrade, dialogue was also frequent as required, but firmness was called for, especially when a violent mob destroyed 2 UNMIK customs service points on 19th February, and again when protesters forcefully seized the UNMIK courthouse in northern Mitrovica on 14th March. After UNMIK police, supported by KFOR, had retaken control of the courthouse on 17th March, a violent mob attacked UNMIK police and KFOR with automatic weapons and Molotov cocktails, resulting in the death of 1 Ukrainian police officer and injuries to others. No further violence occurred after that event, at least not during my tenure. The 17th March events elicited a variety of international reactions, both supportive and critical. Critical reactions seem to be receptive to one of the key arguments used by certain Kosovo Serbs and certain government of Serbia members to justify violence regardless of the post-Troika commitment to a civilized process against specific UNMIK rule of law institutions like customs and courts. The argument was that UNMIK had illegally, quote-unquote, transferred its responsibilities to the PISG and therefore was not in control of these institutions anymore. This was incorrect on both accounts. The progressive transfer of more and more responsibilities to the PISG was, of course, a core requirement under Resolution 1244, and UNMIK has made it very clear to all sides, as I have been explaining, that it was in ultimate control of the institutions, and it was. During all this time, it was, of course, clear that it is necessary to defend a mandate and to implement it that was still there, but that we also had to think about a medium-term strategy. There was a new situation, and we needed to get on with a new strategy. New medium-term UN strategy was called for in order to reconcile to the extent possible the diverging agendas of the 2 groups of UN member states and their local actors. The 4 basic elements of this strategy were identified in spring 2008, and you will still see, of course, traces of these 4 elements today. First element, the Secretary General would report to the Security Council, and in the absence of guidance from the Security Council, take the initiative to reconfigure UNMIK, adjusting to the profoundly changed circumstances on the ground, like the entry into force, or the expected entry into force of the Kosovo Constitution on 15th June 2008, by which the Kosovo authorities intended to, with their recognized backing, take over the SRSG's prerogatives under the constitutional framework. In this context, and that's also part of this first element, the communication from the Secretary General to the Council, in this context, the EU's rule of law mission, EULEX, would come under a UN umbrella, something that Russia and Serbia had requested as a precondition for acceptance of EULEX. In this final phase of UNMIK's life cycle, it would also make sense to appoint a new SRSG. That's the first element. Second element, the SG would signal to Serbia that the UN's readiness to address in talks on practical arrangements, as opposed to talks on status, concerns in 6 areas where UNMIK's mandate had been challenged: customs and courts, which I mentioned already, and also issues like policing, transport boundaries, and religious and cultural heritage. The SG would write to President Tadic about this. The third element is the SG would also communicate and write to Kosovo's President Sidiu. And the fourth element in this plan was that the SG would instruct UNMIK to reconfigure, including a significant downsizing, and he would allow UNMIK to transfer premises and assets to EULEX in the rule of law sector. One of my main tasks then in the spring 2008 was to work with all stakeholders, helping to prepare the ground for the Secretary General's initiative and explain the logic of the 4 points, explain the logic of the package Some actors thought this was a pick and choose, but it was a balanced package for the Secretary General, and this is what we tried to explain at the time. At the same time, of course, we had to provide our headquarters with a detailed reconfiguration downsizing plan and making sure the mission was ready to implement it if and when the instructions from New York would come. On 12th June 2008, the Secretary General submitted his report to the Security Council, attaching the letters to President Tadic and President Cedillo. 8 days later, on 20th June, the report was discussed in the Security Council, and broad support was given to the SG's initiative. There was no presidential statement at that time, but there was no opposition to what the Secretary General has. No red line was drawn, and so the SG felt encouraged to go ahead. On the same day, after that debate, I handed over my mandate to my successor, Lamberto Zanier. Now, development since my departure. My successor received instructions on the reconfiguration of UNMIK, as expected. Meantime, UNMIK has 500 staff as opposed to the around 6,000 in my time. However, that is basically UNMIK proper. The OSCE is still a pillar of UNMIK, but today there's basically no UN police anymore. UNMIK police, it's all gone over to ULEX. And of course, he's received instructions on handing over equipment and buildings to ULEX at the same time. And at the same time, he has received instructions on facilitating talks between Pristina and Belgrade on the famous 6 points. Things went reasonably well with UNMIK getting smaller, I think they did, and ULEX deploying technically, and with the International Civilian Office under the International Civilian Representative Peter Veit, who is also the EU Special Representative, playing an ever-increasing role in helping the Kosovars to consolidate their states step by step. Some credit for this largely stable development belongs to the new Serbian government, who has a more realistic approach to the Kosovo issue and is committed to working with the EU and looking forward and not backward, at least in principle. Whether in this context it was a good idea to refer the legal issue to the International Court is another question, but that's not my mandate. A critical point was reached around November, at the end of November 2008, when the Security Council discussed a report from the Secretary General that included information on a UN Belgrade agreement on how to proceed further with regard to the famous 6 points. Such an agreement was deemed necessary in Resolution 1244 terms in order to get Russia and Serbia to finally agree to the full deployment and legal switch on of EULEX in all parts of Kosovo. At first, the leadership in Pristina rejected the agreement, but in the end things worked out. There was a presidential statement at the end of November 2008 in the Security Council, in which, in Resolution 1244 terms, the way was paved for EULEX's full deployment and legal switch on in all parts of Kosovo as the rule of law, international rule of law mission, replacing basically UNMIK in this whole area. And on 9th December 2008, this led to the actual launch of EULEX in every respect, which in turn did much to improve perceptions in Kosovo and was welcomed by Pristina's leadership. Meanwhile, the Kosovo Security Force has been created as foreseen in the Ahtisaari plan, which was yet another step in the direction of getting on with hard work of creating a functioning state. Much remains to be done. We will have some very interesting things in the near future. We will have, I think it looks like there will be, there's ongoing discussion, of course, on the 6 points. What role would UNMIK play in these discussions? If possible, of course, Pristina and Belgrade should directly interact. That is everybody's wish, at least in the international community. EULEX has a working relationship with Belgrade as well. And the question, of course, is what role would UNMIK play in these talks on customs, on ports, and on boundaries and transport and religious and cultural heritage. Now things are ongoing in this respect, and the talks on these 6 points is but one aspect of it, because all of this is, of course, in the Ahtisaari plan with a clear basis for how things should move forward in this direction. You might have realized that on 30th June there was a deadline for Kosovo Serbs to come back to the Kosovo police service because they had boycotted the Kosovo police service ever since February 2008. And what you might know, what you certainly you, the experts all know, is that actually they have come back in great numbers and they're rejoining the Kosovo police service. Another interesting point this year will be the 15th of November, because I think it's all but decided, no, it is decided that there will be local elections. As we had foreseen in November 2007, when we had actually threefold elections, very complex elections, Kosovo-wide elections, local elections, municipal elections, and mayoral elections. For the first time, the mayors were elected directly. We will now have 2 years after that a repetition, new local elections, because the mandate for that element was only for 2 years, because we were expecting that status would come. We were expecting that the decentralization proposals in the Special Envoy's plan could play the major role, and then you would need a new legitimacy for the new municipality. When it comes to the elements in the Ahtisaari plan, the decentralization, especially the decentralization and creating the new municipalities, things are underway, and Kosovo Serbs are actually engaging in the municipal preparation teams to create these new municipalities. That would be then the basis for the elections later this year. Some final remarks. I think Kosovo, when we talk Kosovo now, we talk about consolidation rather than actual crisis situation. It's fragile, yes, and we could also talk about the economic situation. I haven't talked much about the economic situation now, but certainly could. But I think we must acknowledge the incentive of EU eventual membership and the good that this incentive does. The EU's Thessaloniki promise to the Western Balkan countries. In my view, this incentive is strong enough to discipline all actors, including the Kosovo Serbs and the leadership in Belgrade and Pristina. This would at first include an understanding how to proceed further with the contentious 6 points, but it would hopefully include an eventual structured relationship between Serbia and Kosovo, because I think the EU cannot accept new members with territorial issues, quote-unquote territorial issues. Of course, the EU also has to use its leverage, but I have no doubt it will. As an added conclusion, let me share with you some of my final remarks from the time when I left Kosovo, when I said it has been an honor and a privilege to work for the Secretary General as his special representative and head of UNMIK during a very critical period. It was my aim to implement this unique threefold mandate in good faith with all parties, and in this way to contribute to peace and security, to stability and progress in Kosovo and in the whole region. I'm very grateful, and I still am, to